back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. Good to be back from doing all of my Tony Robbins work over the week. But I've got interviews lined up, great conversations. I've been waiting to bring Jane Leavy on to talk about all things Babe Ruth. She'll be in town at the Babe Ruth Museum this weekend. And, of course, with the Sports Legends Museum not being there anymore and the Babe Ruth Museum, I'm always checking in with Mike Gibbons. I saw him at the 1983 World Series event. And anytime we get more information on Babe Ruth, I'm always interested in that. He's my dad's favorite baseball player. We welcome Jane Leavy on. She is Jane Leavy 1. That's Leavy. And the number 1. She's down in Washington, D.C., but making her way up here to promote her new book, The Big Fella, Babe Ruth and the World He Created. Jane, good day to you. I know you put a lot of hard work into this, and here in Baltimore, the folks over at the Babe Ruth Museum, ever since I got Harmon Killebrew's autograph in 1973 at the Babe Ruth Museum when I was a boy, I've had a fascination with the Bambino, so I'm looking forward to seeing your book.
Well, I hope you enjoy it. You know, Mike Gibbons was largely responsible for giving me the courage to do this, because one of the first interviews I went in and I asked him, you know, what do you think is the best book on Babe Ruth? And of course there have been many very good Babe Ruth biographies, and he said it hasn't been written yet. And that's what made me feel brave enough to go ahead and do what I swore I would never do.
Well, writing books, and I've written 4 of them, and I know you've written a bunch of them as well, and Squeeze Play and The Last Boy and Mickey Mantle and Sandy Koufax. It is a labor of love, and there has to be a reason. There has to be your own, master statement or thesis statement to say about why you want to lock yourself in a room and do something that for an extrovert like myself is a tremendously introverted thing to do, which is write a book. But you're out trying to research this. I think the big story of Babe Ruth, and Mike has always been upfront about this, and I remember doing, like 30 years ago, doing a tour over what is now Cardinal Gibbons and over by the hospital off of Caton Avenue, and where he played his childhood ball. I did all that with the Babe Ruth Museum people, but they've always, I guess for all of my lifetime, been trying to figure out where the lore ends and begins and where the truth is and the called shot and all of what became sort of Santa Claus stories, right, for Babe Ruth. Stuff that didn't really happen, but it sure sounded good because it was Babe Ruth. Let's make him Paul Bunyan. Let's make him larger than life, right?
Exactly. And the thing I wanted to do at the beginning, when I first started, the first time I went to the Babe Ruth Museum with my 7-year-old son in 1995, I wanted to inhabit that caricature. And I thought that the only way to do it was in fiction, because I never could have imagined the digital revolution that would come along and supply me with family documents, birth records, death records, divorce records, as well as old newspapers that made it possible for me to find out things that all my predecessors, with all their access to living relatives and acquaintances and opponents, couldn't get to. Because I spent a whole year before I agreed to do this researching his life and reading all those books. And what stuck out was that there was nothing about him as the boy, Little George. It was as if he emerged fully fledged in an Orioles uniform in 1914 with Jack Dunn in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And my repertorial sense said, if there's a story that's not told, there's usually a reason for it. And so I thought, if I could find the boy, if I could find the voice of the little boy, I would be able to understand the big fella he became.
Jane Leavy covered the Baltimore Orioles many moons ago, back in the, the Justice Kirkchin days? I'm not sure, but she was at the Washington Post. She writes books now about her love of baseball and a lot of things baseball. What made you love baseball in the beginning? And, my last name's Aparicio, so I was kind of born into it, Jane. But I'm trying to find in the modern era what makes people connect to baseball. And Babe was still very sort of alive in the 70s and 80s to me as a boy. on the backside of Baltimore and stories. There were lots of people. My dad left Scranton, Pennsylvania when he was a boy and took the train to New York to see the Babe play with his dad. So, like, I grew up in a house where my dad saw Babe Ruth play, so it meant something to me. I think some of these legends sort of go away to some degree, and I wonder what a 10-year-old boy would have use for Babe Ruth at this point when he can have use for LeBron James or for Tom Brady or whatever the modern thing would be. But Babe Ruth was the first of all of this, and I've done so many conversations about Babe all these years, but I think it's very, very hard for a kid who grows up with an Instagram account and a phone to really appreciate baseball as a national pastime and Babe Ruth as a mythical hero when he was alive, because many of the writers, unlike you as a journalist or me in the modern era, there was a lot of sort of hero worship that went around on the Wheaties boxes and selling cigarette cartons and everything that went on around baseball, building brands. I mean, it was really one of the first American sports brands that was built was Babe Ruth, right?
Yeah, and he had the first sports agent, a guy named Christy Walsh, who was the real template for Jerry Maguire. And while he didn't actually stick out his hand and say, "Show me the money," that's basically what he did. He acquired Babe Ruth as a client in February 1921 when Christy was out of work, having been fired from his most recent job. And he found out where Ruth was staying, climbed out the fire escape. Yeah, this is in Manhattan, I might add. Went to Babe Ruth's room, saw the window was open a crack, let himself in, found the Babe in bed with a blonde, slapped him on the butt and said, "I want to represent you." And this is the kind of moxie that Babe Ruth would have, A, appreciated, and B, when he offered him 10 times as much for the ghost-written stories that had been appearing under his byline, that certainly got Ruth's attention.
What is the common misperception that in your book you're looking to say definitively this did or didn't happen? Because I think that becomes the hardest thing with all of these tales of lore, right, as to where the truth ends. And obviously this was your goal 100 years later, right, is to
Sure.
get at what were the myths and what are the truths. What are the biggest myths and where's your truth buster in all this, Jane?
So if you go out on the street today and ask people, why was Babe Ruth sent to this school, St. Mary's, they'll say, well, because he was an orphan and it was an orphanage. And they'll still tell you that. I still have people at readings come up and say that to me. He wasn't an orphan. And he was at pains to say in repeated interviews, "I had parents." But he never went much further than that. And the other thing people will say to you is he was an incorrigible, which was a term used in Maryland to describe boys who got in trouble with the law and got sent to St. Mary's, which was, in fact, a reform school, to get them straightened out. But it turns out that neither of these things is true. What is true is, and these are the things that you can find in archives thanks to the digital revolution, is that his parents' marriage was a disaster. They either had 6 or 8 kids. His sister Mamie, who passed away in 1992, always said it was 8, of which only she and Babe survived. But I could only find documentation for 6 kids. But of those 6 kids that I found, 4 died in infancy.
Wow.
And of the 4 who died in infancy, 2 died of malnutrition. So feature this. You're 7 years old, so you think you're 8 because his mother didn't remember what year he was born, and they send you away to St. Mary's. Not because you're an incorrigible, not because you're an orphan, but because their marriage fell apart. Because George Sr. divorced Katie Ruth, accusing her of adultery and drunkenness, and got custody of the 3 kids, and as soon as he had the power to do so, he sent his son away. And the most amazing Baltimore story about this is that just as I had finished writing this long thing about the trip out West Lombard Street and then on South Gilmore out to Wilkins Avenue, out to what was basically pasture land in 1902, a story shows up on my computer screen, which I wasn't even looking for, about a Baltimore street cop named Harry C. Birmingham, who, it turns out, took Babe Ruth who was then Little George, to St. Mary's. It wasn't his father, as has been written in myth repeatedly. It was this beat cop who patrolled West Baltimore and who had been an old friend of George Sr.'s. And he saw what kind of upbringing Babe Ruth was getting living above a bar. And he said, this is not good for a little kid. So
are there a lot of pictures? Are there pictures of that bar? I mean, I've never seen that part of it. We've always heard Camden Yards was built on the grounds where Babe's dad had the bar and all that stuff. I'm not familiar with that. I've never asked Mike Gibbons about that.
Actually, there's only one picture of father and son, and that was taken in George Ruth Sr.'s last bar, Ruth's Cafe, which is right opposite the Bromo Seltzer
really?
Tower.
Okay.
And it's now called the Goddess. It's now a gentleman's club. and Babe Ruth used his winnings from the 1915 World Series to buy his father that place.
Next time I go to the Goddess, I'll remember that, Jane.
Oh, please do. Next time you go, you take me with you. I haven't set foot in it.
6 blocks from my house.
George Sr. had operated a variety of different places. The place that his first bar was at 426 West Camden, which is, since all the change in the neighborhood down there, that address doesn't exist anymore. But I have pictures of it, and I can show it to you. But what's amazing to me is that because it was the cop who took him up to St. Mary's, not his father, that I think is where all the rumors came from, that he was incorrigible. Yes, he arrived with a policeman. He wasn't in police custody, however. And Harry C. Birmingham, just before he died in 1947, said about Babe Ruth, he wasn't a bad kid. Sure, he was mischievous, just like all boys are mischievous, but he never gave us, meaning the police, any trouble. So you ask what myth gets knocked down, the idea that he was this bad kid and then had to be sent away and then spent his adult life being as bad as he had learned how to be as a boy.
She is Jane Leavy. She has written a book on the Bambino. She'll be at the Babe Ruth Museum here this week as well. And so what made you do this? You said it took Mike a little while to convince you. And what was the moment that pushed you over the edge that you felt like you had something to say that nobody else had to say?
I think it was finding the documents about his childhood and understanding that there was a new story to tell and that I could find a new way to tell it. Because what I decided to do was not write a traditional biography, which is, I think, frustrated some readers who like beginnings, middles, and ends. But I modeled it on the 1927 barnstorming tour, organized by his agent, Christy Walsh, where Ruth and Gehrig and Walsh did a sort of valedictory lap around the country, just weeks after Babe hits the 60th home run, crowing, 60, count them 60, let's see some other son of a bitch do that. And 2 days after they beat the Pirates 4 straight in the World Series with Ruth hitting the only 2 home runs. And so he goes out to the country where kids, fall out of bandboxes in every town they went to, attaching themselves to his arms and his legs and sometimes carrying him off the field by on their shoulders, because he was the most accessible athlete probably that's ever lived.
A man of the people, the Bambino, separating the fact and the fiction. You can find her out at Jane Leavy. That's Leavy and the number 1. She'll be down at the Babe Ruth Museum this week signing the books. The book is The Big Fella, already a New York Times bestseller. And for these other books and for baseball, I want to have a little baseball conversation with Jane. When's the last time you covered a baseball game as a beat reporter? Has it been that long? I mean, and how long were you on the beat? Because I know you were around the Orioles. I remember your name. I remember your bylines with the Post because I was at the Baltimore Sun during that period of time. Baseball's changed so much in these winter meetings and where the Orioles are and our corridor. And I know you live down in D.C. I'm very, very worried about the future of the Orioles in Baltimore, Jane.
I would be too. I mean, there's certain kinds of management. I would cite the Washington Redskins as another example. They just can't escape from their ownership. And it seems like the Angelo Sons are doing a better job. I mean, the general manager they've hired and stats guys they've hired are geniuses. Look what they did for the Houston Astros. So I see some hope there, but it is going to be a long way back. But, Janet Marie Smith, who is my great friend and who is hosting the event at the Babe Ruth Museum on Saturday from 3 to 5, built the most beautiful ballpark in America. The first retro ballpark, nothing's come close to it since. So they have this asset in the jewel of a place to play, and it's just, it's horrifying how they've squandered it.
Well, and the other part of that also is that the Nationals, and when this thing's written at the end, and I've written a book called The Peter Principles that you can Google, and I've sort of recapped all of the horrors over the last quarter of a century for our city. But the biggest thing is Peter got all of the money sucked out of the Nationals deal, and when he's gone and they're gone, someone's going to have to figure out how to rebuild this up here, and anything south of Columbia doesn't exist anymore. That money's gone. Those sponsors are gone. Those eyeballs are gone. The Nationals and that ball. It really worried me at the All-Star game, Jane. I went down there for the Fan Fest on the Monday back in the summer, and I hadn't been down there since, I don't know, Billy Joel 2 or 3 years ago. I don't actively go to Nationals games, But I was down there, and I saw, a dozen cranes in the sky. And Tom Boswell said, yeah, there's folks are calling this one of the top 10 hot neighborhoods in the world. And I'm thinking to myself, all of these people, all of this money on the metro, cities coming together, what's left for the Orioles? No one from Reston, Virginia is ever going to an Oriole game again. And that makes Middle River and Towson and Ellicott City and Pikesville and Dundalk more important for the franchise. And they've just done such a horrible, horrible job. And the money is the part that worries me because people don't want to come downtown currently until we get the city cleaned up for crime and other things. And then there's just the part of baseball becoming very old, very white, and the people who love baseball don't come to the game. I'm very, very worried about this as a guy who's made my living off of doing this since 1984, Jane.
I've laughingly said, but not laughing that hard, that they could solve the pace of play issue very easily if they just eliminated spitting and scratching. And I think they could have eliminated the problem about the two franchises competing for the same audience had they fairly split the Masson money, because there might have been a more collegial way to build a rivalry. God knows those rivalries exist and survive in Chicago and in New York and in Los Angeles and in places like Kansas City and St. Louis. So, it's just been so bitterly contested over the TV money that, there's never going to be any cooperation between those two franchises. It's just not going to happen.
Well, I tell you what, there's going to be a knock on the door. The Angelos boys are going to have to cut a really, really healthy check to the learners, and we'll see what happens in the aftermath of that. But always appreciate the time of people taking time to create insights and create good books that we can read and learn about Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth and the world he created. The book is The Big Fella. Jane Leavy is our guest. You can find her at Jane Leavy and find the book and find her along with Janet Marie, who's also one of my absolute favorite people in the world, at the Babe Ruth Museum this week from 3 until 5. Jane, we'll stay in touch and hopefully talk some more baseball come springtime around here. We don't have much to talk about once the season starts here next year as Oriole fans.
I think you've got hope now. I think the front office people they've hired are exemplary. I just got finished reading the book about Astroball.
I've recommended Astroball to everyone. I had Ben Ryder on the show. What an amazing book, huh?
Absolutely. And so, two of the main architects of that renaissance of the horrible Houston Astros, are now taking up residence in Baltimore. And it's going to take time, but I would trust those guys to get there.
Really appreciate you taking some time and discussing the book and making some time for us. We'll see you up here. Get a crab cake while you're in town at the Casa de Bambino, as I always tell Mike Gibbons.
I will be there.
You got it, Jane.
You'll come too. Take care.
Thank you very much. Jane Leavy joining us here. She'll be in Baltimore on Saturday from 3 until 5 down at the Babe Ruth Museum doing the book tour. The Big Fella is the book. If you want to learn more about Babe Ruth, you can do that. Always great to have Jane around, as well as any authors. We've been doing a lot of authors around here. Took a couple days down earlier in the week. Ran some authors. Jack Gilden doing the Unitas book. It is the holidays. No excuse for not giving Dad a good book. Astroball's also a really good book. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. Facebook Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and anywhere the World Wide Web travels in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.